Hello, everybody, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Sig Murphy, and I am joined by some colleagues that I will introduce shortly. We are very happy that you've joined us today to talk about retail cybersecurity. This is a topic near and dear to all of our hearts, especially as we head into the holiday season with the transaction volume getting higher, and a lot of our retail clients live or die by their success or failure in the holiday season. It's an important topic and I think very timely for us. My colleagues that are joining me today are Dave White, who is our forensic lab director and also has 30 years of law enforcement experience. Ingrid Beierly, who is a colleague of mine that I've worked with for over a decade from one of our law firm partners at Manatt, Phelps Phillips. We're going to jump into some more in-depth introductions here in the next slide. And as I mentioned earlier, my name is Sig Murphy. I am the practice director for the West and Tola regions of North America here at Cylance. I handle oversight and delivery of all of our engagements in those regions, be they proactive, i.e. pre-breach services, or reactive incident response services after a new client is breached. My job is to make sure that all of our engagements are successful and that we hit all of our clients' goals. Before joining Cylance, I have many years of incident response experience, in total about 25 years of cybersecurity. Spent 12 years at the Department of Defense as a defense contractor at the Defense Cybercrime Center, and I worked in the intrusions team there, which was on the forefront of a lot of the intrusions that were occurring against our armed services. I also, back in 2006-2007 timeframe, started to do work as a forensic lead for large-scale commercial intrusion investigation. And I worked on a number of the cases that you've probably heard about in the news, and most of them I cannot talk about, but I'll talk about a few today throughout the talk. And one of them that is public record because the attackers went on record talking about my team and the efforts that we were part of to bring him in, the TJX investigation, which is the parent company of TJ Maxx and Marshalls. And at the time, it was the largest retail cybersecurity event in history. It was really foundational for a lot of the new cybersecurity measures that were put out by the card brands and kind of the evolution of the PCI DSS. But I am extremely excited to be presenting today with two of my close colleagues, and I'll hand it over to Dave White for his introduction.
Hey, hello everybody. My name is Dave White, and I'm one of BlackBerry Cylance's principal consultants. I also serve as the forensics lab manager here in Irvine, California, where our headquarters is located. And prior to joining Cylance, I served 30 years in law enforcement. And during that time, I worked a lot of different assignments. I worked typical law enforcement. You go to the police academy, and then from there, you hit the mean streets of whatever city you're patrolling. So I did patrol and all facets of patrol. And then over the course of about 8.5 years, I worked as a operations manager and forensic examiner for an FBI computer forensics lab. So I did that type of work for about 15 years of my 30-year law enforcement career. One of the FBI computer forensics labs is in Orange, California, and worked many cases, again, like echoing Sig, can't talk about. And also as a common thread to Sig, we also worked the TJ Maxx case. I did a bunch of forensics on computers that were seized, kind of in the West Coast arm of that huge investigation. And I say it was huge because it encompassed the entire country. So we kind of worked the West Coast portion of that, did a lot of computer forensic analysis to kind of benefit that case. But now that I'm with Cylance, I'm very excited to be working in the cybersecurity realm, and very excited to be on this panel with Sig and Ingrid. So I'll send it over to Ingrid now.
Thank you very much. Hi, everyone. This is Ingrid Beierly. And first, I want to thank the Cylance team for giving me the opportunity to participate in this webinar. I'm very excited about it. My name is Ingrid Beierly. I'm Senior Advisor for Manatt, Phelps Phillips, part of the Privacy and Data Security team, where we provide advice to our clients with respect to privacy issues, CCPA and GDPR. We also provide advice with respect to cybersecurity and incident response. So prior to joining Manatt, I was with Visa for about 13 years, where I managed fraud investigations. Similar to Dave and Sig, I actually was the one that handled the TJX case back in the day. That was a lot of fun. We were essentially responsible for working with clients in the event of a compromise involving merchants and processors, so a lot of insights there. I worked a lot with law enforcement as well during my tenure at Visa, helping them out on their investigation, and with other organizations as well, like the National Cyber Forensic Training and Alliance in Pittsburgh, and also the CERT organization. So again, I want to thank Cylance for giving me the opportunity to participate in this webinar. Very excited about it. I'm going to hand it over to Sig.
Okay, thanks, Ingrid. And I am excited as well. Obviously, all three of us bring a little bit of a different view to the problem that is retail cybersecurity, and excited to share that with the audience. So today we're going to talk about the payment card cybersecurity threat landscape, and Ingrid, with her vast experience, is really well positioned to talk through that. Then we're going to talk about some common and recent types of malware, and Dave and I are going to talk about that. At any given time, Cylance has between 25 and 40 IRs going on. So we, as a next-gen AV vendor, we also are at the forefront of a lot of waves of malware. So we typically will see trends occurring and kind of emerging in those waves before a lot of folks in the industry. So we're going to talk about some kind of current threats there. And then we're going to talk about how to protect your organization from this type of cybersecurity and fraud, specifically with respect to retail organizations and retail clients out there, both small and large. And then we definitely want to get your questions, so please feel free to use that Q&A widget at the bottom of Zoom to get your questions in, and we will be handling those at the end of the talk as well. And I will pass it back over to Ingrid.
Thank you so much, Sig. Before we talk about the threat landscape that's happening in the payment card space, I thought it'd be good to just step back a bit and go over a typical transaction flow, really for the purpose of identifying who the players are in this space. I think oftentimes merchants get a little bit confused as to who the players are. So let's just go over this real quick. As a consumer, we obviously use our card at a merchant, whether or not we use it at an e-commerce merchant or at a retail merchant where we present our card. Well, that data is in the back end, gets sent to the acquiring bank for that particular merchant. The acquiring bank's job is to route that data through the payment system for processing purposes. And then depending on the type of card that's used, whether if it's a Visa card or a MasterCard, it then gets sent over to the payment card brand, to the respective payment card brand, and they will go ahead and forward that transaction to the issuing bank who issued that card. So when the issuing bank gets the card, they will verify whether or not it's a legitimate card, whether it's been reported lost or stolen, and that the account has the appropriate funds available to pay for the transaction. So once that's been done, they generate an authorization message or code and route that back through the same way. And it gets sent to the merchant to conclude the sale. So obviously, as we all know, I mean, I don't know about you guys, but I do shop a lot, so it's, you know, it's fairly quick as far as the transaction is concerned. Obviously, you know, there's a massive amount of transactions that get processed in this space. I can speak about Visa. They can process 24,000 transaction messages per second. I mean, that's just on a normal day. During the holiday season, it's much more. So who are the players in this space? So we know about the association, the payment card brands. You know, obviously that's the Visa, the MasterCard, the Discover, JCB, and Amex. These entities regulate the card acceptance rules and interchange for their member financial institutions, which includes the acquiring side of the house, and the issuing side of the house, and also member processors. The acquiring banks is the entity that has a direct relationship with merchants for the purpose of card acceptance. Acquirers are ultimately responsible for making sure that the merchants comply with the card brand's operating regulations, and the regulations are fairly, like it's a massive document, and it includes compliance with PCI DSS. And the issuers, the issuing banks, obviously those are the companies that issue the credit card to you and I, or debit card. Issuers don't have a direct relationship with a merchant, with the exception of Amex. Amex works a little bit differently, in which they are both an acquirer and issuer. Then, of course, you have processors out there, and they can be a processor which is direct connect to the acquiring bank, or direct connect to the payment card brands, or to the issuers as well. And they handle all or some of the functions of a credit or debit transactions, ranging from providing terminals to managing back-end solutions. And you have ISOs, and that stands for Independent Sales Organizations. And these companies sell services of a bank or a processor. And they also sell things like front-end terminals and back-end processing solutions as well. Then you have merchants and consumers. We know who they are. Other types of service providers I want to highlight. You have payment gateways, and these are aggregator as well. And they process transactions for e-commerce merchants or mail order, telephone order merchants, and they're better known as card not present merchant. You have other types of service providers as well. You have point of sale vendors, and these are entities that develop payment applications and sell them to merchants. Point of sale vendors, they don't typically process transactions, but they may have remote access to the merchant's environment for the purpose of administering the point of sale system. You also have integrators out there, or resellers, and they work closely with point of sale vendors, in which they sell payment applications to merchants, very similar to point of sale vendors, in which they may not process transactions, but they probably have remote access to a merchant's network for the purpose of administering point of sale system. You also have web hosting entities and third-party IT management. So as you can see, there's many types of entities out there that may have access to cardholder data. So let's talk about some of the threats that's happening out there in this space. These are the top threats. It's been around for a number of years. However, they continue to be the main choice of exploits that criminals are using to steal payment card data. So I want to talk a little bit about the card not present fraud involving insecure web application here. That's really impacting the e-commerce space. Because the retail industry or brick and mortar industry is migrating to EMV technology, which provides better fraud control because EMV generates dynamic data, it helps with fraud-related issues. So these criminals are looking for ways to steal cardholder data, and so now, or actually since 2016, the industry has seen an increase in breaches involving the e-commerce space. So we have some stats. These are statistics of actual cases that the payment card brands have worked on or currently worked on. And one of the things that they do when they work on these investigations is that they try to identify, what type of merchant it is. Is it a retail merchant or brick and mortar, or is it an e-commerce merchant? From 2016 to 2019 stats, in 2016, the industry saw an uptick of e-commerce breaches in which e-commerce were at 55% versus brick and mortar at 44%. In 2017, e-commerce was at 76% and brick and mortar was at 19%. In 2018, e-commerce was at 80% and brick and mortar was at 5%. And this year to date, e-commerce is already at 82% data breaches versus only 12% with brick and mortar. Again, we believe it has to do with the EMV technology that's being deployed, which is a good thing. And now hackers are migrating over to the e-commerce space to perpetrate fraud. I think the other issue with the e-commerce space situation is that what criminals are doing, they're targeting service providers that supply solutions to e-commerce, solutions such as analytics or integrations to various e-commerce merchants as a means to compromise the website. Earlier this year, there were several service provider CDNs that were breached, and the criminals were able to modify the JavaScript that was hosted on these CDNs. The malicious code within these modified files were integrated into the merchant's e-commerce site using the service provider solution. So effectively compromising numerous merchants with just one successful code injection. And what we're referring to here, malicious code, is really what's prevalent out there is the online skimming attack, the JavaScript attack. ATM targeted attacks, this is interesting as well. And what I'm referring to here are ATM cash out schemes. It doesn't happen very often, but when it does happen, there's a lot of money that they can take, they meaning the bad guys. ATM cash out schemes is essentially a scheme involving hackers gaining elevated privileges on an issuing bank or a prepaid processor. And they're able to manipulate the card management system to increase withdrawal amounts and reset PINs. They're able to dispense, using malware, large amounts of cash by using counterfeit cards. They have money mules that they have engaged to collect this cash all over the world. One of the first ATM cash out cases that I worked on, we looked at the transaction data that we were able to obtain, and we saw the amount of ATMs that were used to perpetrate this type of scheme was incredible. In less than 24 hours, the criminal was able to get millions of dollars in cash, obviously. And they used 20,000 or so ATM machines that was spitting out the cash. So it's a very organized, very orchestrated attack. Apparently, a majority of the banks or issuing banks and prepaid processors that are impacted by this type of attack are occurring in other countries, and specifically in the CEMEA region, Central Europe, Middle East, Africa. So the account takeover attacks, and this is also interesting, and this is mostly impacting e-commerce merchants. It involves using stolen credentials. Unfortunately, there's been a lot of data breaches out there and credentials that are being sold underground. Well, the bad guys are monetizing these online accounts because with a valid login, a criminal's activity is very difficult to identify. And they're monetizing the illegal access in a number of ways. They can do things like purchase physical products with the account, card on file. They can drain an account, any stored value, things like loyalty points. They can also perpetrate fraudulent orders. What that means is that using legitimate credentials, they can log into a profile at a merchant website and perpetrate these fraud orders. They can change shipping addresses. They can also perform account testing because when stolen cards are being sold underground, the criminals are wanting to test these accounts to make sure that they're valid accounts. Why would they waste time on accounts that's not valid? So what they do is they utilize these stolen credentials to perpetrate account testing against a merchant. And usually when they do account testing, it's like, penny off, very small amounts to prevent detection. The other issue that the industry is seeing is also these insecure third-party vendor remote access, which have been around for a number of years. Merchants engage third-party vendors to manage their systems remotely. Unfortunately, these vendors are using very insecure protocols. They're using remote desktop protocol, which has no authentication. They use VNC, and these are just examples. During my tenure at Visa, I worked on a lot of these cases And from a forensic perspective, is very challenging because you're looking at hundreds of merchants that's been compromised, and you're trying to figure out what's the common denominator here. Well, at the time, the common denominator was this vendor that was using the same credential for all of their customers. So I mean, it was just crazy. Once they get in on these systems, they use RAM scraper malware, which, again, another piece of malware that's been around for a number of years, to steal payment card holder data in RAM. Because when these authorizations are happening on a system, it's being processed in the clear. And the bad guys know that these merchants are no longer storing cardholder data on the system. So they're stealing them from memory. It's been around for a number of years. There's many variants of it. It's very configurable. These RAM scraper malwares, it can be configured to target specific point-of-sale applications. From a communication perspective, the functionality of it is a command and control server somewhere on the internet to exfiltrate the cardholder data. So how do payment card brands get informed of potential data breaches? Well, there's many forms, but a majority of these cases are reported through a process called common point of purchase. A common point of purchase, otherwise known as CPPs, is when multiple fraudulent transactions are identified by issuers or the card brands themselves in doing analysis, and the only common denominator of these transactions prior to the fraud is a particular merchant. So fraud has already been reported to the system. The issuers are reporting it to the brands, and that's how a majority of these cases are initiated. Usually there's an investigation that's involved, and depending on the merchant level, the brands may mandate a PFI investigation, which is another topic to discuss at some other time. PFIs are essentially security organizations that's been approved to perform this PCI-related investigations. They call them PFI. And one of the things that they do is to determine what are the data elements at risk and what's the exposure window. So once that's been completed, the brands will then go ahead and send out these account numbers that were believed to be at risk to the issuing banks for fraud monitoring or reissuance of these cards. Now, the issuers, it's their business decision whether or not they want to block these cards. They may want to wait until the card is expired or monitor them for fraud. If there's a ton of fraud on an account, they may go ahead and block and reissue, because blocking and reissuing is, there's cost involved with that. There's operational issues. So really at the end of the day, it's the issuer's decision on what to do with those cards. Unfortunately, there are fines involved in PCI-related type of breaches, and depending on the size of the breach, the brands can levy a fine to the acquiring bank with this amount. In addition to the PCI fines, there's also liability assessment on data breaches involving counterfeit fraud. The brands also get notification from law enforcement as well, and how these investigations are initiated. They work very closely with law enforcement. During my tenure at Visa, I worked a lot with Secret Service, in which they may have an ongoing investigations that were able to recover a whole bunch of card numbers, and they need the brand's help to determine where these cards may have been used legitimately to identify the potential compromised merchants. That gets reported to the brands as well. And the last thing is self-identification, which, to be honest with you, it really doesn't happen very often, where the merchant's suspected compromised entity has identified breach on their network and reporting it to the brands. Doesn't happen very often. And like I said, a majority of the cases that the brands are working on is usually through the CPP process.
Ingrid, thanks for that very detailed overview of the CPP. And I just wanted to kind of dovetail on that, since there was a law enforcement mention. In my time in law enforcement, I worked a lot of cases, with the FBI, Secret Service, and the banks. Those were investigations that we as a local police department spun up the investigation, where maybe it started with, we had some fancy malls in Newport Beach. And so maybe one of the store security folks watched a crew go in and grab 15 mink coats off the rack and go up to the cashier and cash out using, unbeknownst to the store, but stolen credit card information. A lot of times the crooks will acquire these lists of credit card numbers, expiration dates, CVV codes, and whatnot. They'll encode them on the backs of white plastic, we call it. So all of those gift cards that you see in the grocery stores, they'll just go in and grab those. Anything with a mag strip on the back. Now with the hotel room keys, all sorts of things, we would find victims' credit card information encoded on. And then the investigation would lead out to their car, where they've got, just boatload of stolen PII and other identity theft related wares in their car. There's usually co-conspirators involved and getaway drivers and all sorts of things, very choreographed for high execution on these high dollar items like, jewelry and coats and things of that nature. Also wanted to mention that a lot of gas station investigations where we would identify that the compromise point was a specific gas station in town. And so we would set up surveillance and work those types of cases. What we would find is that a lot of wireless technology was involved. And so they'd put credit card and debit card readers and cameras on the gas pumps. Then they would drive by at an unsuspecting time, Sunday morning at 2 a.m. or what have you, after the weekend's kind of done. Everybody's gassed up for their trips, and they've got all the credit card information on their devices that are embedded inside the gas pumps, and they drive by with Bluetooth or wireless technology to download that credit card or debit card information. So that would become a kind of common point, a choke point, if you will. So then, of course, we circle back on the ATM cash outs that Ingrid was mentioning, and the FBI has warned banks for years that the cyber criminals are carrying out these types of ATM cash outs, very, very highly choreographed global fraud schemes. Cyber criminals are hacking into, maybe a bank or a payment card processor, and they use clone cards at cash machines around the world to fraudulently withdraw millions. I think last year, the experts in this arena were reporting that 85% of the ATMs they tested allowed the attacker to access the network, which is not a good thing. Cyber crooks are using black box attacks, which kind of the fastest way to get into these cash machines, and usually takes under 10 minutes to pull these things off. But the banks, security companies are getting keen to this type of attack, and they're putting in safeguards to kind of thwart off these cyber crooks. ATM jackpotting is another big thing now, where that's kind of the exploitation of the physical and the software vulnerabilities in these automated bank machines. And it results in, the machines dispensing cash, and, with having physical access to a machine, the cyber crooks, the theft of the machine's cash reserves is what they're going after, which are not typically tied to the balance of any one bank account. So, there's a lot of things going on, but let's kind of talk about these current challenges in retail. And we hear a lot about PCI DSS, and it's a confusing topic, but the acronym's getting thrown around. What is it really? At the end of the day, it's a set of industry standards that are basically designed to protect payment card data, and it's the payment card industry data security standard. So PCI DSS, and it's really intended to create an additional level of protection for both the customers and also the brands as well. So it's to reduce the risk of data breaches involving the personal card holder data. And so these set of industry standards are really comprised of 12 kind of broad requirements, but collectively they cover more than 200 different item requirements. So they can be further broken. These broad groups can further be broken down into six key areas. Building and maintaining a secure network. So we're here talking about retail fraud and data theft today, but coming from an incident response, a cybersecurity standpoint, with law enforcement background, building and maintaining a secure network is a critical component of PCI DSS, and protecting cardholder data is critical. Maintaining a vulnerability management program, implementing strong access control measures is very important as part of a key area process in this arena. Regulatory monitoring and testing of networks, and also maintaining an information security policy. These are all critical key areas as it relates to PCI. So as it relates to PCI across the cyber threat landscape, what's the bad news? Well, the bad news is that retail organizations demonstrated the lowest PCI compliance sustainability across all key industries. That's scary, because that's where a lot of our money as a consumer goes, is to retail organizations and consumer products and goods and e-commerce and all that sort of thing. 77% of companies assessed after a data breach were not in compliance with the number one PCI requirement, and that's install and maintain a firewall configuration, something as simple as that in the cybersecurity realm. So these are things that we need to take into consideration. The good news, though, is that the number of businesses that are 100% PCI compliant is growing considerably year after year. So that's the good news. Current challenges in retail, as depicted on the slide, data is often stored in several different locations depending on its utility to the retailer. Payment card handling standards, the regulatory requirements for that are currently only require the data to be encrypted in transit. So it's when this data is not encrypted and stored and the threat actors have access to it, that's not a good day. And then the data stores, they're targets for cyber crooks, because it houses such a boatload of information, not just the data that's on one or two folks' computers, but it's these data stores that they're being targeted for the cyber criminals. And then, of course, you can simply Google the number of data breaches, and a lot of these data breaches involve third-party vendors, and so that third-party risk is there. The hackers are trying to target vendors of these companies for third-party data breach, because why only go after one company's data if you can actually go after a vendor who works with multiple large companies and collect even more PII, personally identifiable information. So it's very, very keen for the threat actors to be going after targeting the third-party vendor. Sig, did you have anything you'd like to weigh in on this?
Like Dave said, there's some pretty well-known breaches in Target and Home Depot. They are very, very foundational to looking forward, the changes in cybersecurity as it relates to retail. The third-party vendors with Target, of course, that changed the landscape on risk. Really, I think, led to a trend that we are still seeing today, where executives are more involved in cybersecurity due to the sheer volume of that breach. Target has done a great deal of work to try and really uplift their security, and they should be commended on that. And same with Home Depot. So the situation where they were in the process of updating their point-of-sale terminals, and basically the older terminals were vulnerable to a specific type of malware, and since then they've taken some pretty big strides to upgrade those as well. But both of those have some pretty large cost to them. You'd heard from Ingrid about different types of attacks, and specifically RAM scraping as a major type of attack. Here's a couple of other things that are in use by the attackers. So phishing emails these days are still a very large vector inbound to our clients' environments. Basically, network, as you know, is only as secure as your least sophisticated user. Unfortunately, these days, about 1 in 4 users, so 23% of users, click on spear phishing emails. We know that that's an industry percentage that's put out by a lot of vendors that do spear phishing testing, and we are a vendor that utilizes that for some of our red teaming, and we can confirm that. Traditionally, the attackers would put malware into those spear phishing emails. they would basically rely on people to click on the malware and infect their systems and use it as a bastion host to get access to the environment. These days, they're just changing it. They're basically, now that everybody's on O365 or G Suite, they are just putting links into landing pages that collect or harvest your username credentials, your username and password, and then they're using that to get into the environment. So slight change there, but being very effective. They also use that to carry out business email compromise or account takeover type of attacks. PUPs, we call PUPs the potentially unwanted programs. So not necessarily malware. Programs that could be used by either a sysadmin for legitimate purposes or an attacker for attack purposes. And the trend we're seeing in the last few years as well on this with retail is that attackers are getting into the environment and then they're utilizing the tools that are available to them. So if you might use sysinternals tools or your sysadmins do to manage the environment, attackers will utilize those tools as part of their attack. And last but not least, we talked about RAM scraping. There are other types of harvesters as well. And the trend that we're seeing really in 2019 is that these harvesters are becoming polymorphic and they are also becoming auto-propagating. So in effect, they have worm-like qualities, and every system that they're infecting, the malware changes a little bit so that it's harder for traditional AV to detect. But the attackers are going after lots of different targets related to retail clients. They're going after, of course, the payment card information. They're also going after the, that transaction chain that Ingrid talked about for the processors and others. They're going after data that would give them information into the chain. They will also, we see a lot of times, unfortunately, attackers, we might have multiple attacks going on in our retail clients where they're utilizing harvesters to go after the personal banking information of employees, while on the other side, they are going after that payment card data as well, which causes a lot of disruption for our clients. And we talked through basically a lot of the vectors inbound and the malware here. It's important to realize that no matter what pathway the attackers take into the environment, they generally will go through a couple of different steps. We're going to talk more about this in the cyber kill chain slides in the future here. But basically, for the really, really sophisticated attackers, they do a discovery phase. Most people think that the attack starts at the vector, the actual foothold stage. It does not. For a lot of the large-scale organizations out there, if you process a lot of money, do a lot of transactions, the attackers will actually fingerprint your environment looking for things like patch level on external-facing systems so that they can do a race condition to get in to vulnerabilities that are not announced yet. But when they are announced, a lot of times we see the attackers will get in using those vulnerabilities before the sysadmins can patch. And I saw that in one of my investigations at a very large financial institution in the United States where the attackers were able to use Apache Struts 2 vulnerability to get into an environment before they were able to patch it. Then they're going to compromise systems. This can be through any vector we talked about previously, but the important thing is that they gain access to a system. Then they're going to go lateral. They're going to install their malware. They're going to go through the environment looking for payment card applications and the payment processing chain. And then once they're in, they're going to do what they came to do. So they're going to do card capture information, or they're going to go after user input, doing kind of keystroke logging, whatever they need to get to the end result of getting the financial data. All right, Dave, you want to talk about Magento?
Yeah, thanks, Sig. Yeah, so as Sig mentioned, kind of the malware that we're seeing in the industry, the top malware for last month, as reported by the Center for Internet Security, Emotet was #1. So Emotet first emerged in 2014, and it was threat designed to steal banking credentials and other sensitive information. It's often propagated like Sig mentioned, through phishing emails containing an infected document or a malicious website link, things of that nature. So the other two that we're seeing that are on the top 10 list as of last month are TrickBot and WannaCry. And TrickBot, again, is a modular banking Trojan that targets users' financial information. And it also acts as a dropper for other malware. So the threat actors use that, dump additional malware onto the various systems so they can propagate the network. And then WannaCry and Ryuk ransomware. These are ransomware worms that spread, rapidly through the computer network. And ransomware, of course, encrypts files on the hard drive and then demands, ransom payment, usually in Bitcoin, in order to crypt those files. So backups on computer networks are key in that arena. But yeah, so the Magento attacks that we're seeing in the cybersecurity world is they're becoming more and more popular. And the reason, why, might you ask? Well, the e-commerce sites are attractive targets to the hackers, right? And so Magento is one of the big e-commerce vendors out there that provide your online stores and so forth. And so what happens is the personal and payment information is required to complete a sale, even if the system doesn't directly process the credit card transactions. A compromised site could reroute customers to a false page, alter their order before it's transmitted to the payment processor, and things of that nature. So these issues can have long-term consequences for not just the customers with financial loss and identity theft, but also the merchants. They can face reputation damage, merchandise loss. There's higher processing fees involved. Could be fines involved, revoked privileges with financial institutions. And, of course, there's always the risk of lawsuits. So they say that an estimated number of online shoppers served by Magento merchants in 2019 was 98 million. And according to Magento itself, more than 250,000 merchants worldwide use Magento as their e-commerce platform. So it's very popular, and therefore when it's very popular for the general public, then it's going to be very popular with the cyber criminals. And so patch management is key to a Magento attack. The Magento attacks that I've worked on the cybersecurity side always involved a outdated Magento version running, and Magento is very good about pushing out updates and bug fixes and things of that nature. The problem is the third-party vendors that usually host the Magento site on your behalf are not very good at patch management. And so they're usually running version 1X, which we're well into version 2X now. And there are a boatload of updates and bug fixes as everything updates. iOS and Android operating systems for your mobile, they come out with updates all the time. And so those are all bug fixes and security patches that are very critical. Magento strongly suggests that these vendors, or you, if you're running an online shop, to install these full patches as soon as you can. Just to give you an oversight, as far as vulnerabilities, these vulnerabilities are coming in via cross-site scripting and execution code injection and things of that nature. And the vulnerabilities by year have dramatically increased. Back in 2015, there was only 5 vulnerabilities in the Magento platform, and 1 in 2016, in 2017, 3, and in 2018, 1, but 2019, kind of off the charts, 72 vulnerabilities. So the most recent Magento security update, kind of secure the online e-commerce platform of a particular online store, just was released last month. It basically contained tens of security enhancements to help close remote code execution, or RCE, and cross-site scripting, XSS, or other vulnerabilities. So very important to download those. And Magento is very security minded with their Magento Security Center website. They've got a tool on there that will scan the e-commerce site for vulnerabilities, and you can monitor your site for security risks and update malware patches, and detect unauthorized access with that tool. And it's free from Magento Commerce, so highly recommended to get that. And then there's other tips and tricks to protect and secure your online store if you're running Magento, and everything from two-factor authentication, which is critically important, to enabling the CAPTCHA, which is that combination of letters and numbers that sometimes you can hardly read to verify human response. There's also some admin panel security updates that they recommend, and all that can be found on the Magento site. Here, I'll kick it back to Sig.
This is great. Basically, the cyber kill chain is a way for folks to think about modeling a traditional cyber attack onto what the armed services use for their warfare. And it breaks down each phase of the attack and talks about how you can thwart the attackers. I had the pleasure of working with one of the authors, one of the two authors of this at my time at the DoD, and it's a great way to think about how to really thwart those attacks. So from the top to bottom, if you look at those phases, reconnaissance we talked about earlier. So know what's out there, know what's in your environment. The development is where the attackers can customize their malware. And delivery and exploitation and command and control are also very key places where you and your organization can effectively thwart the attackers. On the delivery side, we talked about spear phishing as a vector. We talked about malware. So spear phishing, you have to train your users. You have to have effective technologies in place blocking that. There's a lot of good technologies out there. On the malware side, we strongly believe here at Cylance that next-gen AV is one of the key ways to protect yourself. So that endpoint, getting that locked down through next-gen AV is one of the key things, but it's not the only thing. For large retail clients, you want to do a defense in depth strategy. You want to do not only your next-gen AV, but you want to have network visibility as well, looking for network threats. Next-gen firewalls are very important. And then if you have the resources, some sort of log aggregation and analysis platform, something like Splunk is also very good. But with that, I know we're running out of time here. We do have one question, which is what is the most secure way to process a credit card? And Ingrid, I think with your experience, you'd be perfect to answer that.
Sure. Thanks, Sig. So my suggestion would be is to implement EMV and point-to-point encryption, because what we're talking about today is the transaction is being processed in the clear, and the bad guys are taking advantage of that, and they're stealing it from memory. So I highly recommend for retail merchants, if you haven't done so already, is to implement EMV. And with the whole liability shift as well, it's something to think about. What the liability shift is, in the event of fraud, you merchant would not be responsible, would not be liable for that fraud. You have to process, I believe it's like at least 75% of your transactions must come from a chip technology. Again, highly recommend for folks, for retail merchants, to implement EMV and point-to-point encryption to encrypt the data as soon as the card is either dipped or swiped. It's encrypted throughout, so nothing can be taken. Thank you.
Thanks, Ingrid, and that's a great key technology there. We also want to hit on what to do if you're a victim. There are numerous studies out there that show that there's a couple of low-hanging fruit items. First and foremost, if you're a retailer or you operate in the retail sector, you should already have a very knowledgeable cyber counsel. Folks like Manatt that specialize in doing cyber litigation and cyber investigations, and they will be your number one resource for what to do and when to do it. The DSS and all of the various regulations and regulatory bodies are confusing without proper guide there. And then, of course, having an IR plan is key as well. There's a study out that showed that the average cost of a retail breach these days is over $2.3 million. And if the firms that had an IR plan were actually able to save, on average, over $600,000 of that. So that's really key, to have a plan and to know who the parties are, and then also work with counsel when you're developing that plan. We really appreciate you joining us today, and we've really, I think, had obviously a lot of information to cover here. Thank you all very much, and a big thank you to my co-panelists here, Dave and Ingrid, for their participation and their expertise.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you all.